Welcome to Faith and Politics, a show dedicated to discussing issues surrounding the intersection of church, state, and politics, and the examination of whether you're allowing your faith to shape your politics or your politics starting to shape your faith. In other words, what do you do when God and government come face to face? I'm your host, Orland Johnson. Let me introduce you to our panelists that we have for today. First, we have Mr. Lawrence Brown, who's the senior pastor of the Queensboro Seventh-day Adventist Church in New York City. We have Ms. Bettina Krause, who's the editor of Liberty Magazine. We have Ms. Melissa Reed, who's the director of government affairs for the North American division of the Seventh-day Adventist Church. And we have Ms. Jennifer Woods, who's the general counsel of the Lake Union Conference of the Seventh-day Adventist Church. Ladies and gentlemen, great to have you here with us and looking forward to our conversation today. You know, as Christians in a country like America, we should be grateful for the opportunities that have come from our ancestors who decided that when they were going to leave Western European countries, they wanted to find a place that first and foremost had religious freedom. They wanted to make sure that we would be in a land where we call it being called liberty for all, especially in the area of religious freedom. However, even as we have come to a country where we were looking for religious freedom, we wanted to also make sure that we wouldn't create an environment where we were using religious freedom to be more of a sword as opposed to being a shield. We started seeing rules that were put in place regarding no same-sex marriages, wanted to make sure that even interracial marriages and things of that nature didn't move forward. And the fact is that we are in a country where religious freedom seems to be at the highest level of thought by the population. However, there are other individuals and other leadership groups and other new, smaller, nuanced groups that are thinking that maybe we have lost our focus, that America is a Christian nation. And as a result thereof, Christianity should be what is buttressing everything that we do from a religious freedom standpoint. You know, Bettina, when I hear that type of conversation, that type of talk, where for all intents and purposes, you're creating an environment where you are wrapping the flag or wrapping the Constitution around the cross or some other, what I would call religious, artifacts or ritual of some sort, it's almost impossible to tell where you start to find the line from a ritual as opposed to a religion. Because once you cross over into being a religion, there are a whole lot of benefits and things that come to your aid, even the ability to be able to discriminate in the name of your religion. When we take a look at this activity, what do we do in terms of making sure that we don't take this too far? And this whole idea of the United States being a Christian nation, how does that cause other religious groups to feel?
You know, I think you're right, Orland. We have this confusion that's developed over decades between, are we a Christian nation or are we a nation that has Christians in it? And I think part of the way going forward is to understand our history, because historians have done a fantastic job of unpacking this kind of generic American Christianity, which has become known as civil religion, this idea of a generic Christianity, you know, the idea of one nation under God, you know, the motto, in God we trust, the idea that our founding fathers were basically evangelical Christians. I mean, this is a sort of idea of civil religion, which is religion stripped of its real meaning. It's become a ritual, a patriotic or civil ritual. And, you know, it's interesting, Orland, that this has actually been the creation of a very intentional, well-funded national effort starting in the 1940s, right through to the 1950s and the communist scare of the 1960s, the Cold War, that enlisted the aid of advertising executives and others to really push this idea that America had a common religious heritage. Roosevelt, Truman, Eisenhower, they cultivated this idea. So, you know, you ask what's the way forward in understanding all of this? I think we need to understand our history as a starting point.
And Bettina, I couldn't agree more. I think that this narrative that we have bought into this of our history, it's so important because you're right. We think about, the Pilgrims coming and religious freedom and, but whose religion, whose we say, under God, who's God? What form of Christianity? Because even if we look at the actual history of this nation, let alone the complete disregard of anything outside of Christianity, right? We saw infighting even amongst the different religious factions, Catholics versus Protestants, and then different sects within Protestantism itself. But this is not what we're being taught, or at least not what I was taught growing up. I'm hoping, one way to combat this is that educating and giving a more robust and full historical account of the founding of this country and whose Christianity was actually dominating in this country, because it definitely has implications today.
Orlin, I am thinking about this conversation as a Christian living in America. And to me, even more important than looking back at sort of the history of the country, which and the intent of the founding fathers, is who am I called to be as a Christian, a person of faith? And I look at the life of Christ here on earth, right? He was very specific about he did not come to establish a government, a government here on earth, right? And he gave us as followers of his very clear directions that we as individuals are called to disciple and to evangelize, not to use the government as the mechanism to do those things. That was an individual calling because we have that individual relationship with God. So just the sort of idea, and Bettina and Jennifer hit it exactly right, is you're covering a political ideology in a wrap of faith, right? And that's so offensive to me as someone who that is a central part of my identity. It's the core of my identity is what my faith is. And I think it cheapens what faith is to everyone, to all believers.
But Lawrence, when you think about this, we come back from the concept of, let's call it Christian nationalism. Let's just look at it as being religious nationalism, because that population group will tell you, we're just trying to do those things that are quote unquote more, what we would call in the betterment of all of society. No matter what religion you are, you should treat your neighbor well. No matter what religion you are, you should look out for your fellow man. Isn't that where they're really going? Is there something dangerous even in that?
Well, here's the thing. I don't know if you've ever seen this happen or had it happen to you. You're driving on the highway. Perhaps you should have pulled over a long time ago. You start getting sleepy, and before you realize it, you're drifting into the next lane. You wake up, and to your horror, you're about to kiss the car next to you. So you overreact, and now the car shoots all the way across the highway the other direction, and you go from pillar to post. In fact, I saw it happen just a few days ago. That's where we are. We have people who have gone too far one direction, and now there's this overcorrection, and they're going the other direction. People look at a lot of these secular issues being pushed today and, let out a scream of fright and say, oh no, we're going to hell in a handbasket, and then they want to go the other direction. And I want to be honest with you, what really concerns me is that in too many instances, you have on the covering and the gloss and the fervor that comes from religious affiliation without the moral constraints. And that's very problematic. Jesus said, my kingdom is not of this world. His whole motion, his whole move was about getting ready for the life to come. And that's why, as an evangelist, I'm not just trying to win Democrats. I'm not just trying to win Republicans. I'm not just trying to win independents. I'm trying to win everybody, because there's a better world to come after this one. And God never indicated he was going to use the systems of this world to get us ready for the next world.
But I guess, Bettina, there has to be some context here that causes people to think about in God we trust, the using of the concept of the creator when you go through the Constitution, when you look at our money, when you look at all of these different things. There clearly was supposed to be something connecting the dots there. But I guess the question is, what exactly was it supposed to be? And as people make their own interpretations of it, can we really say that they are flawed in their thinking, even when you look at what some of the original intent was?
Orlin, I think Dr. Brown hit it right on the head. I mean, regardless of this very broad discussion about what the original framers meant with the religion clauses, Dr. Brown said, this is a conversation today that is driven by fear. Mm. It's driven by fear on the left, and it's driven by fear on the right. I think when we talk about religious nationalism and Christian nationalism, people start getting confused and they say, hey, can't I even, why are you trying to keep my religion out of the public space? And so I think we need to make that distinction between bringing yourself and your faith and your values into your exercise of civic rights and responsibilities and, shaping your views on issues of public policy. On one hand, that's okay. We can do that. We should do that. But on the other hand, merging our Christian identity with our national identity in a way that's toxic to minorities, whether people of faith minorities or ethnic and racial minorities.
And Bettina, here's the joke. The joke is that frequently we see woeful misapplication of the process. In other words, people who are supposedly Christian and supposedly advocating for Christian ethics and principles, hypocritically turning a corner and operating in a very unchristian manner. And, I've gotten to the place where I said, okay, I think I understand now. If you're in one party and do something, it's wrong. But if you're in the other party, it's either not wrong or we'll turn a blind eye to it because of where you stand. That's not how Christianity works. It's a principle that applies across the board. And you're not seeing that today.
Absolutely. You're spot on.
Orlin, and I think it's so important, jumping off what my fellow panelists have said, that's why we have that both religion clauses are so important. Because yes, your identity as a person of faith is protected, should be protected. It's valuable to you. That's why we have the free exercise clause. But we have the establishment clause because, again, the founding fathers had come and seen, they had experienced, many of them firsthand, what religious persecution, what religious discrimination was like, and they wanted to put those safeguards in place. I think Lawrence is exactly right as far as we are overcorrecting. We're seeing that, unfortunately, in so many different areas of our society right now. I think it's time to steady the ship and focus on those important things.
I think when I hear about the idea of where we are and when we make these decisions, I'm actually one of those people that some people have a problem when I say this. I actually trust the American people. And I trust the American people that sometimes they do swing the steering wheel hard. There's no question about it. But I think they're swinging it hard because they realize something fundamentally needs to change. And I think if we trust it enough and try at some point that you're not snapping it the other direction, but finding it coming over a little bit slower to a right positioning, I think at that point we'll find ourselves probably being in a much better place. And hopefully our fellow men will continue to love one another as well. There's an interesting case in the state of Maryland where we're finding parents that are fighting back. The name of the case is actually called Mahmoud versus McKnight. And in that particular case, in Montgomery County School Board, Department of Education has been forcing pre-K and elementary age children to read some books that would be deemed controversial. They promote a one-sided view of transgender ideology. They're encouraging gender transitioning. They're focusing on this quote unquote excessively romance with no parental notification. All of this type of activity seems to be becoming part of the mainstream conversation in our society. Now, there are individuals who have certain Christian beliefs and other religious beliefs that have a problem with this, and they are pushing back on it. And we now have parents that are basically asking to be notified when these type of books are going to be made part of what I guess we would call the reading list for our children, and the ability to be able to step in and tell a school board that we are not comfortable with this. Now, Melissa, when you take a look at cases like this that are starting to move forward and you ask yourself the question, all right, different locations, different localities have different societal points of view, and maybe that should be what covers the day. But in reality, this is a public school system that we're talking about that's making some very, very, what I would call interesting reading that really brings in some things that could be causing those who have certain religious beliefs to want to push back. What do you think about this particular case? And from a societal standpoint, what is this telling us?
You know, Orlin, I have lived in Maryland for over 30 years now. Montgomery County is the county over from where I live, and I am frankly very surprised. This is my community, and I don't recognize it, frankly. It's surprising, you know, this area of the United States is very diverse in its population groups, both its race, ethnicities, and also our religious identities. And that's one of the things that I love about this. And so it's very surprising to me. It has been very surprising to me, sort of this posture that the Montgomery County Board of Education has taken. Again, they started out this program, and I understand the intentions of the original of the program for inclusivity. But that said, they started off with the opt-out option for parents who had some issues or challenges or concerns with the material and the age that their children were being introduced to various subject matter, and then immediately switched that position and have really sort of gone all in to the point of now going to court over the fact that that this is what the school will be doing. And it's surprising, again, not just because of the the population group that lives here and the population group that is responding as far as with a legal lawsuit. This is Christians, this is Muslims, this is Jewish families, Catholics, Protestants. It's a diverse group of parents who are expressing concerns. And there are opt-out options available, required by the state of Maryland, as in most states, for things for like a teaching of sexual education or human sexuality and family life. And then the board itself has an opt-out clause for religious diversity, but not applicable to this particular program, this particular series of inclusivity books. And so that's why I have a real challenge, because it seems like they are not acting in good faith in the way that they have done in so many other instances.
I think that's what caught my attention with this whole thing, Melissa, is that, they have this program as far as if you're teaching on human sexuality, then they have the opt-out, right? But by having this other program, they're kind of going around that, including it into other classes. And then they say, well, we no longer have to do this. And it does seem like there's this, they're not being genuine. There's this trying to go around the system to not allow parents to opt out. And this is such sensitive material. I have 2 young boys, and I would definitely want to be able to be, at the very least, notified. And this is, my old county as well. And so I do find it somewhat surprising, because it is such a diverse county, serving so many different viewpoints and so many different, different people. And so it's a surprising move on the end of the board.
No, but Tina, this looks like exactly one of the issues where you find secular groups that are wondering, why are we seeing certain agendas being pushed? Or religious groups that are wondering, is this a secular concept that's being placed upon me because of what I might believe? The idea that this board was so kind of like, dug in on this concept to the point that they're willing to go to court and fight it. You almost can't help but wonder, is there a political agenda going on here? But they claim that that's not the case.
So the far left often uses the phrase, religious freedom shouldn't be used as a sword. It should only be used as a shield. And I think what you are seeing here, Orlin, is a very clear example of, on the far left, ideas being used as a sword. And so both ends of the ideological spectrum can be accused at times of engaging in intolerant and bigoted behavior. It's not it's not only the fault of religion. It's not only the fault of those who are more on the progressive end of the spectrum. So what we need here is as Melissa and Jennifer have pointed out, we need to reclaim the middle ground, the common sense discussions that we engage in as a society that allows us to sort of protect this zone of dissent where you can have different points of view. You can have religious folk and those, who object to some religious ideas living together and educating our children together in a public school system in ways that allows us all to be accommodated. But I think what we're seeing here is this sort of push to the extremes on both sides. And frankly, it is undermining the public confidence in the idea of common education for our young people. When we have, abandoned any sort of common sense, civility, or when we're faced with these, frankly, very difficult conversations.
Lawrence, you live in a very diverse community there in New York City, and there's a group there that will say that, for example, the LGBTQ plus community believes that if there was more understanding or training or acknowledgement of who they are and what they stand for, that there might be more tolerance for them. And I think part of the conversation that Montgomery County was having was we want to inform these young people from a standpoint of something that's a real part of their society. Is that something that's that bad, or is there something that we're missing in that concept of trying to allow another part of society to be recognized?
Well, it's all relevant depending on who you're talking to. I have watched the videos where parents have taken these same books to school board meetings and town hall meetings, stood at the podium reading the actual print of the book, and the board members having a fit because of how graphic it is. And I'm laughing, saying it's too graphic for this meeting, but the people in charge of that meeting have signed off on this being given to the kids. Now, when I was in law school, there were courses I had to take if I intended to graduate, and there were courses I could take that had no bearing on whether they let me out or not. And some would argue that making this material available, period, is a problem. And I understand that. But what I'm going to say is, rather than making this something that everyone has to deal with, if you want to make it something that's available, but parents and different groups have a chance to say, hey, X, Y, Z, that's probably the more appropriate way to go. But let's face it, a lot of these groups see as an existential threat to their existence the fact that some groups preach that according to the word of God, this is a lifestyle that's abhorrent to God. So the other side now hears that message and decides, well, if we don't just push back, but push back hard, we're going to be in trouble. And from a standpoint of process or procedure, it makes total sense to try and reach the youngest generation possible, because if you remove the sting from that crowd, it largely gets you out of harm's way. So I understand the thought process. I get where they're coming from. That doesn't change the fact that much of this has nothing that looks like common sense about it at all. And that's a problem. It's a problem. We're talking about our kids, and this can be handled better than it's being handled right now. But it seems we go from crazy to crazier to just when we thought it couldn't get any crazier, it does. And I don't know where that stops.
But Melissa, I got to ask this question, though. I might be comfortable maybe with, if Jennifer is one of the parents in my community and she's helping to determine what our curriculum and reading looks like, that may be great. But when we start turning over what our children are being taught based on what the parents in that community think, I'm not sure that's exactly the best way to handle this either. I mean, supposedly you've got professionals that are supposed to be making these decisions and not just allowing whatever some parents feel that their kids should have or should not have, because you could find many different arguments. I mean, how do you find the balance in this where you let the professionals take the lead and making sure that you're not using the personal agenda of parents to set an agenda for a whole community? Or should the personal agenda of parents be setting the agenda for the whole community?
Well, I think that's one of the issues that the parents were frustrated with, is the quote unquote experts that were involved in crafting the program or providing the resources was actually an LGBT rights group that is known to be aggressively hostile towards religion. And so if that's who you're looking at to sort of create this curriculum, like Bettina said, you're very much coming at things with a sword rather than with a shield. You're coming aggressive, right? And if you read in the story, and I know you all did, there were comments from board members that were really nasty towards people of faith, as far as, we're not going to allow you to continue to teach hate and things like that. So I think what has been additionally surprising to me is that there has been a initial court ruling against the parents, right, in favor of the school board. And what that ruling said was that in order for the government, this policy to violate the free exercise clause, it must burden religious exercise, and that just the mere exposure to this material or to these concepts does not burden that exercise, and that it actually has to go to the point of coercion or indoctrination. But when you're talking about, I guess I would argue, if I was one of the parents or part of the legal team, is when you're talking about very minor children dealing with very mature subject matter, the exposure itself, they are not in a place cognitively that they can make decisions or sort of, make it what they're hearing from their teacher or what they're reading in the classroom. That is truth, right? And so I think I'll be interested to see this case continue on. I hope that that again, we can find a way to both teach love and acceptance and respect for all of our populations groups.
I'm gonna have to let that be the last word, but I think you've hit it right on the head, that leadership has got to get to a point where they're not just simply a thermometer, just reacting to whatever the heat is, but they're turning themselves into the thermostat that will actually bring it down to a reasonable level. And then hopefully at that point, we can have some real conversation. Bettina, tell me something I don't know.
So, Orlin, you've heard the saying, families that pray together, stay together. Did you know that really entered the psyche of Americans back in the 1940s when the government sponsored 5,000 billboards across America with that slogan on it? It was a government PR campaign.
Didn't know that. Lawrence, tell me something I don't know.
Well, in light of everything that's happening in our schools today, this one seems long ago and far away, but it was back in 1989 that a firestorm was unleashed in New York City when the book Heather Has Two Mommies was introduced into the reading curriculum. And in light of some of the things we're dealing with today, that moment is beginning to seem a little tame.
That's absolutely true. Melissa, tell me something I don't know.
Okay, Orlin. Did you know that Montgomery County, Maryland has a median household per capita income of over $99,000, which may sound quite a lot for many of our viewing audiences. It makes it one of the wealthiest counties in the United States.
Didn't quite know that was that number. Jennifer, tell me something I don't know.
Sure. So a Pew Research study found that a majority of Americans think that business owners should be able to refuse to provide services if providing those services could suggest support of certain LGBTQ beliefs that they have personal or religious objections to.
Wow, thank you. Listen, I appreciate all the comments that we got and all the information and a lot of topics we're going to have to keep talking about. Thanks again for being here with us. Hope you enjoyed our conversation. Just remember, if it's about God and government, it's faith and politics. See you next time.